Well, it's 10 o'clock, and we'll start the meeting. I want to say good morning to everyone, and the hearing will come to order. Today's hearing is the first of the year for our subcommittee. I want to welcome all of the returning subcommittee members. We appreciate all of your hard work. Warm welcome to a couple of new members. They're in another hearing, and they'll be along in a little bit. Today, the subcommittee is going to hear about activities and operations of the IRS from the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, J. Russell George, and the National Taxpayer Advocate, Nina Olson. We appreciate their willingness to share their expertise with us again and to appear before the subcommittee exactly 364 days since they were here last time. As a matter of housekeeping for the members, we'll follow the 5-minute rule during the question and answer period. I don't plan on cutting anybody off in the middle of their sentence, but if everyone could keep their comments and questions to about 5 minutes, that would be appreciated. And we will recognize the members in order of seniority based on who is seated at the beginning of the hearing, going back and forth between the parties, and latecomers will be recognized in the order that they arrive, going back and forth. Now, last year was a good year for this subcommittee. It was the first time since 2008 that the subcommittee's bill was brought to the House floor under open rule, and that's thanks to the leadership of Mr. Rogers, the chairman of the full committee. And we don't know when the Budget Committee will complete its work on the budget resolution, but both the House and the Senate Appropriations Full Committee chairmen have said they intend to bring all 12 bills to the floor this year under regular order. And by that I mean the process by which appropriations bills that reflect our funding priorities are marked up. They're subject to amendment in the committee and on the House floor, and then they'll be conferenced with the other chamber. And for the first time since 2010, the administration submitted its budget request on time in accordance with the Congressional Budget Act on the first Monday of February. And while timeliness is always appreciated, a budget that spends more, taxes more, and borrows more is not. Within the President's request is a massive $2 billion or 18% increase for the IRS. Earlier this month, the IRS Commissioner told the Senate Finance Committee that the IRS was not asking for an increase. No, they were just asking for the money that was taken away. Well, if the Commissioner believes that the IRS is just automatically entitled to $13 billion, I think he's making a mistake, because entitlements are for Social Security benefits, they're for Medicare, Medicaid, and so forth. Providing for the national defense is a constitutional obligation, but even the Department of Defense has to come in and appear before the Appropriations Committee. They have to justify and defend their requests. They got to provide reports and briefings and subject themselves to congressional oversight and hearings before Congress, and that's before we provide them any funds. And so the IRS will have to do the same thing. I think we all want the IRS to answer the phone most of the time. We want them to prepare forms and instructions. We want them to process returns and process refunds. We want them to pursue criminals and tax cheats. But I also think we all want the IRS to administer the tax code in a fair and objective manner. We want them to respect the constitutional rights of taxpayers. We want them to safeguard taxpayers from identity theft. We want them to be a good steward of the funds that are provided by this Congress. And while the IRS has exhibited a litany of questionable practices and expenses over the past 5 years with regard to processing tax-exempt applications, bonuses, conferences, videos, and now hiring, what I really want to hear today from you all is how the IRS has or could change its ways. After 5 years of budget cuts or freezes, I would hope that the IRS has turned over a new leaf, studying its budget line by line, identifying its highest priorities, re-engineering its business practices, and concentrating its resources, both people and money, on what matters most. For example, the Commissioner frequently complains about the audit rate going down. But my question is, could the IRS do a better job of selecting which cases to audit and which ones not to audit? Has the IRS refined its selection criteria to reduce the rate of false positives, cases that are selected for audit but do not result in a tax liability. I would say, why expand limited resources and burden taxpayers if they are ultimately found to be tax compliant? So we deliberately lowered the IRS funding to a level to make them think twice about what they are doing and why they are doing it. They don't have a dime to spare on anything frivolous or foolhardy or mediocre. The IRS should and must focus on the most important and most egregious and the most in need. So again, we welcome General George and Mrs. Olson. We look forward to your testimony and working with you on improving the IRS. And now I'd like to turn to my ranking member, Mr. Serrano. Thank him for all the work that he's done last year as we worked together. Didn't always agree, but we brought a bill to the floor, and appreciate his efforts and insights. And so I'd like to yield to you for any opening statement you might like to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And on that note, I just want to say that had it not been for that last airdrop from the Senate on our bill, you might have seen a different behavior on our side, on our bill, totally, which would have been historic in recent times. But nevertheless, I appreciate the work. We also have, besides Mr. Quigley, Mr. Fatah and Mr. Bishop. Fatah and Bishop being new members of the committee who will be here sometime during the hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would also like to welcome the Department of Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, J. Russell George, and National Taxpayer Advocate Nina Olson back to the committee. I know you're all very busy, so I thank you for making the time to be here today. The IRS ensures the collection of taxes and provides taxpayer services. Approximately $3 trillion in federal revenue is collected by the agency each year. The agency employs a staff of around 100,000. These individuals help millions of Americans to file their taxes, process 237 million tax returns, and conduct tax audits and investigations. Without the work of the IRS staff, the federal government would not be able to function, since they collect the vast majority of the revenue that allows that to happen. As many of us are aware, the IRS has implemented the recommendations of the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration to remedy problems resulting from the inappropriate targeting of liberal and conservative 501c4 entities. I applaud the agency's undertaking to implement reforms and prevent problems from repeating. With that being said, there are many challenges that the IRS is currently facing. The IRS has been severely underfunded for several years due to budget cuts made by this committee, which I strongly oppose. These budget cuts have made it difficult for the agency to hire and maintain personnel who are essential to carrying out taxpayer services and enforcement, and who are the ones who are charged with fixing the problems at IRS. As a result of understaffing, the IRS is anticipating that in FY 2015, it will only be able to answer around 50% of the calls they receive from taxpayers seeking assistance. That percentage goes up or down depending on when they release seasonal workers. That is a 57% decrease from the level of the agency, the agency was able to function at over a decade ago in 2004. The IRS also anticipates being unable to collect $2 billion in taxes owed to our nation's government as a result of these cuts. I hope we will get a chance today to discuss the impact of these cuts in your eyes. The current operating budget is at its lowest since FY 2008 and the lowest funding level since 1998. When adjusted for inflation, since then the number of filers has increased by 23%. New tax responsibilities set forth by the Affordable Care Act and the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act passed by Congress are adding to the IRS growing workload. The President's FY 2016 request recognizes the need to provide the agency with a workable budget by requesting more than $1.3 billion over FY 2015. I hope this subcommittee will take that request seriously. We as lawmakers and as members of this subcommittee are charged with the task of ensuring that the IRS is able to do its job effectively, and as a result of these cuts, they increasingly cannot. I'm also concerned with the problems families who claim the Earned Income Tax Credit, or EITC, face. The EITC is a successful national anti-poverty program that helps low-income families attain much-needed financial support. These families make up a large percentage of the IRS audits due to unintentional errors and not fraud. This is mostly attributed to the complexity of the ITC's rules and to errors made by commercial preparers. The IRS should implement several changes in order to reduce the EITC error rate and has made some good steps in this process. As I stated before, cutting the IRS budget will hinder any progress that has been made. I hope that we can assure that the IRS maintains a reasonable budget and is able to make sure that taxpayer programs like the EITC are able to fulfill their mission. I look forward to discussing these and other issues with you today, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Serrano. Now we'll turn to General George for your testimony. If you could keep it in the neighborhood of 5 minutes, it'll allow us time for questions. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Crenshaw, Ranking Member Serrano, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the invitation to discuss ways for the Internal Revenue Service to perform its mission more efficiently and effectively. We've reported that a trend of lower budgets and reduced staffing has affected the IRS's ability to deliver its priority program areas, including customer service and enforcement. In addition, it has the increased responsibilities of implementing certain provisions of the Affordable Care Act. The IRS also continues to dedicate significant resources to detect and review potential identity theft tax returns and assist victims. IRS employees who work the majority of identity theft cases are telephone assisters who work also responds to taxpayer calls to the IRS's toll-free telephone lines. This has contributed to the IRS's inability to timely resolve victims' cases, as well as the continued decline in its ability to timely respond to taxpayers' written correspondence. While the IRS faces many resource challenges, TIGTA has recently reported on several areas where the IRS can operate more efficiently. For example, we determined that electronic filing of amended tax returns could save the IRS money and prevent the issuance of erroneous tax refunds. We believe the IRS could save about $17 million per year if it allowed taxpayers to electronically file amended tax returns rather than only allowing paper returns. Electronic filing of amended returns would also enable the IRS to use the processes it currently uses to verify originally filed tax returns. TIGTA estimates that using these same processes could prevent the issuance of more than $2 billion in potentially erroneous refunds associated with amended returns over the next 5 years. TIGTA also found that the IRS's fieldwork collection process is not designed to ensure that cases with the highest collection potential are identified. With the significant growth in delinquent accounts and the reduction in the number of IRS employees, it is essential that cases with the highest risk and potential for collection are identified. The IRS could also make more informed business decisions when determining how to use its limited resources. For example, the IRS eliminated or reduced services at taxpayer assistance centers. Although the IRS stated that the services eliminated or reduced were, in part, the result of the IRS's anticipated budget cuts, the IRS's plans did not show the extent of how the reduction in services would lower costs. Moreover, it later had to reverse certain decisions. Furthermore, timely reporting of third-party data and additional authority would assist the IRS in improving tax administration. Each year, the IRS receives information returns filed by third parties, such as employers and educational institutions. These returns provide the IRS the information needed to verify taxpayers' claims for benefits such as the Earned Income Tax Credit and the American Opportunity Tax Credit. However, information returns are generally not filed with the IRS until after most taxpayers have filed their annual tax returns. Requiring third parties to file information returns earlier would provide the IRS the opportunity to use the information contained in these forms to verify tax returns at the time they are processed rather than after refunds are issued. For example, the IRS issued more than $3 billion in potentially erroneous education credits in tax year 2012 to taxpayers who claimed students for whom the IRS did not receive a Form 1098-T tuition statement from a post-secondary educational institution. However, even if the third-party information returns are received more timely, the IRS still needs certain authorities to more efficiently and effectively use this data. Generally, the IRS must audit any tax return it identifies with a questionable claim before the claim can be adjusted or denied, even if the IRS has reliable data that indicates the claim is erroneous. The Department of the Treasury has included a legislative proposal as part of the IRS's budget requests since fiscal year 2013 to obtain correctable error authority, which would permit the IRS to systematically deny all tax claims for which the IRS has reliable data showing the claim is erroneous. TIGTA estimates the use of correctable error authority along with expanded use of the Department of Health and Human Services National Directory of New Hires could have prevented the issuance of approximately $2 billion in questionable earned income tax credits claims in tax year 2012. Chairman Crenshaw, Ranking Member Serrano, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to share my views.
Well, thank you very much. Now we'll turn to Ms. Olson.
Chairman Crenshaw, Ranking Member Serrano, and distinguished members of this subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me today to share my concerns about the problems taxpayers are facing in their dealings with the IRS. In my 2014 annual report to Congress, I designated inadequate taxpayer service as the #1 most serious problem facing taxpayers. This year, taxpayers are receiving the worst levels of taxpayer service since at least 2001, when the IRS implemented its current performance measures. Taxpayers call and write the IRS not only to get the answers to tax law questions, refund status, or transcripts, but also to request penalty abatements, respond to math error notices, and make payment arrangements. Yet from January 1st through February 14th this year, the IRS answered only 43% of the calls it received from taxpayers seeking to speak with a customer service representative, and those taxpayers who managed to get through sat on hold for an average of about 28 minutes. By comparison, during the same period last year, 77% of taxpayers got through and waited on hold an average of 10 minutes. The IRS is now only answering the most basic of tax law questions through April 15th and none after that date. And it is no longer preparing tax returns for the most vulnerable taxpayer populations, namely the elderly, the disabled, and the low income. This performance decline is huge and results from a combination of more work and reduced resources. On the workload side, the IRS is receiving 11% more returns from individuals, 18% more returns from business entities, and 70% more telephone calls through fiscal year 2013 than a decade ago, not to mention Affordable Care Act implementation. On the funding side, the IRS's budget has been reduced by about 17% in inflation-adjusted terms since fiscal year 2010. As a consequence, the IRS has reduced its workforce by nearly 12,000 employees, and it projects it will have to reduce its workforce by several thousand additional employees through fiscal year 2015. Like any agency, I believe the IRS can operate more effectively and efficiently in certain areas. However, I do not see any substitute for sufficient personnel if high-quality taxpayer service is to be provided. The only way the IRS can assist the tens of millions of taxpayers seeking to speak with an IRS employee is to have enough employees to answer the phones. The only way the IRS can timely process millions of taxpayer letters is to have enough employees to read the letters and act on them. And the only way the IRS can meet the needs of the millions of taxpayers who visit its walk-in sites is to have enough employees to staff them. Now, while I believe the IRS requires more funding on the taxpayer service side, I also believe it is incumbent on the IRS to spend the resources it has as effectively and efficiently as possible. Reductions in services always should be made with the goal of minimizing the impact on taxpayers and on performance. I find it difficult to ascertain exactly how the IRS made its resource allocation decisions with respect to taxpayer service or what data it relied upon. I have proposed a ranking methodology for the major taxpayer service activities for individuals. This new methodology will take taxpayer needs and preferences into account while balancing them against the IRS's need to conserve limited resources. Frequently, taxpayer needs are best met by personal services that are more costly to the IRS than automated services such as internet-based services. While it may be tempting to migrate taxpayer service toward low-cost self-assistance options in the current budget environment, such efforts may ultimately be wasted and costly if the IRS does not properly address taxpayers' actual service needs. In the absence of a ranking methodology that takes into consideration the taxpayers' needs, the IRS will continue to make difficult resource allocation decisions based on limited data and gut instinct rather than through comprehensive analytic rigor. In my testimony and in my 700-page annual report to Congress, I have provided numerous other examples of programs in which I believe the IRS can utilize its resources more effectively and efficiently, including the math error program, identity theft and the automated substitute for return program, audit selection, and collection case selection. The best way for Congress to hold the IRS accountable for how it allocates resources and makes decisions is through active, consistent oversight of the agency, not just on the issue du jour, but on the routine work the IRS does. This hearing is an example of just such effective oversight. It is critical that the IRS take steps to rebuild congressional trust. It is also critical, in my opinion, that Congress provide the oversight and funding that the IRS needs to do its important work of helping taxpayers meet their tax obligations and collecting the revenue on which the rest of the government depends. In my written statement, I have tried to offer some recommendations to help in this regard.
Well, thank you both for those words. Let me start the questions by, number one, thank you both for being here. And Inspector George, we heard from you about how the IRS could take some actions to be more efficient. They've got limited resources. We know that. And as Ms. Olson pointed out, I have to question, I think we all question, how they are allocating and frankly, how they're prioritizing the resources they have. And I think there's a lot of misperception in the media. You read from time to time, and I want to be, clear. This subcommittee is not here to punish the IRS. We're just trying to hold them accountable. We all want to be more efficient and more effective, and that's what we're trying to do, as you point out. And that includes everything from justifying the taxpayer-funded dollars to the highest level. So let me ask you all have kind of talked about some things that you've uncovered and suggested. Ask both of you all, how is the IRS receiving these thoughts? Are they implementing some of your recommendations? And maybe what do you see as the most immediate that they can do to really help in this 2015 tax season? Could we start, General George? Just how is that being received? Because y'all have really thrown out some pretty good ideas and save a lot of money and be more efficient. Is it working? And what do you hear? How are they doing?
If I may, Mr. Chairman, I have had the privilege, actually, of knowing John Koskinen for almost 20 years. When he and I was staff director of the subcommittee overseeing the transition to the Y2K conversion. And he is a serious, conscientious public servant who realizes the challenges facing one of the most important government entities in the world, and obviously for this nation. He obviously has new responsibilities that the ACA and some extraneous items that he inherited before him, but he is literally willing to call me at home and meet with me at any time to discuss issues that we raise of concern. We list, as you know, required by the Reports Consolidation Act, a list of the top 10 management challenges. And we listed security as the top management challenge confronting the IRS this year. He's providing resources to address that, in addition to, obviously, FATCA, in addition to many of the other areas that are confronting the IRS. So I'm not here to advocate for him in terms of additional resources, but candidly, they are being requested to do a lot more with a lot less. And that is something that, again, needs to be considered.
But do you sense that some of the thoughts that you've outlined to us, are they trying to implement those? Are they pretty receptive to some folks that say, here's a better way to run the railroad?
Very much so, sir. And I'm not, again, not to violate any confidences, but literally today is Wednesday, so on Monday he called me 5 o'clock in the afternoon, to indicate that the initial response they had to a recommendation that we made to them to better conduct business, that he reversed, where the staff pushed back, he changed that view and adopted our recommendation 100%.
Great.
And
Thank you. Ms. Olson?
I would second what Mr. George says about the commissioner. Obviously, I report to him, but I've reported to many commissioners, and this commissioner has very much an open door and does seek my advice. I would say, about half of our recommendations in our annual report to Congress are adopted by they agree to it every year. Now, whether the problem is the devil is in the details. How do we get them implemented? And what I see, and I continue to see after 14 years in this job, is a cultural mindset that really is based on historical practices, and it is very difficult to get people to look at data that might show that their assumptions are no longer based in reality. And that is not a problem that's limited to the IRS, it's in any large entity. But with the budget where it is, that becomes a critical problem. And I have advised the commissioner and identified for him, as I have in my testimony and in my report, programs that I would say to him to take offline and do basically an audit of those programs to really look at what are you doing? How are you selecting cases? How are you getting your false positives? What are you learning from those false positives? And then come back and say, okay, we took this program offline, didn't bring in a lot of revenue from this program this year, but we can prove through pilots going forward that we are going to put so much less taxpayer burden out there, but be much more effective with the resources that we have. And I think there are a lot of low-hanging fruit in the IRS that you can do that with, and some more difficult, but they're known and they should be worked on.
Great, great. Growth and change are difficult at times. Let me ask you one quick question that has to do kind of with this Affordable Care Act, because I know that's creating a burden on the IRS, but the administration delays the employer mandate from time to time, and they've extended the enrollment period, I guess, this year, and they're struggling on the front end of the Affordable Care Act, but I've always had concerns for a long time about the back end that might be even in worse shape. And I guess we all saw what happened. The administration announced that 800,000 low to moderate income households were sent incorrect tax information, or these new 1095s. And that's about 20% of all the people that receive subsidies under the ACA. And I was going to ask you, then I also read that I think 50,000 people file their tax return based on the wrong information as part of that 800,000. And I was going to ask you, what had you talked to them about that? And then I learned last night that the IRS has already said that they're not going to pursue the collection of any additional taxes from the estimated 50,000 people that already filed the return based on the incorrect information. So I guess the IRS has decided they'll just turn a blind eye to that. So I was just wondering, have you asked about that yet, or have they talked to you about that? How do they just ignore the situation? Is that something that you're going to ask about or have asked about?
This is such recent news, Mr. Chairman. We most definitely, we will ask about it, we'll inquire about it, but it is so new to me that I don't have any additional information at this time.
I would say that, first, I wasn't consulted in this decision, and so I'm still trying to figure out what it means. But the IRS always makes a determination of who it's going to go after or who it doesn't, unless we want a 100% audit rate. You know, we're selecting who we go after. I do have concerns about equity. You have the 50,000 who have filed, and they're not having to pay back, but the people who haven't filed are going to get corrected 1095As, and their taxes will be adjusted downward. And we have the California folks who have gotten some incorrect information. And the incorrect information is expected in the first year of any program. We get incorrect information from private businesses all the time. And my office has recommended that there be a de minimis figure so that it might cost more to process a corrected return than it does to recoup the tax from it. My understanding is for many of these 800,000, the actual dollar amount is very minimal, and some of them will get refunds. But still, it raises concerns, and I will be having conversations about that. I only wish I'd been able to have those conversations before the decision was made.
I guess that'll all be added to the tax gap, but look forward to hearing what they have to say. Mr. Serrano, you have some questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. George, IRS employees collected over $3.1 trillion in tax revenue, processed over 242 million returns and other forms, issued $374 billion in tax refunds during FY14, which is really nothing short of amazing when you think about it. In FY14, their budget was $850 million less than it was in FY10, and with the FY15 cut of $346 million, it is now down to 1998 levels when you take into account inflation. You acknowledge this in your testimony and state that sequestration, increased mandates from Congress, and reduced budgets have affected the ability of the IRS to deliver in key areas like enforcement and customer service. You say in your testimony that, and I quote you, budget cuts have resulted in significant declines in the performance of the IRS collection program. Let's go into more detail about those cuts. You say that from FY10 to 14, the budget for the automated collection system, ACS, operations and field collections were reduced by $269 million. Can you explain what ACS is and how those cuts affected it? And Ms. Olson, you could also comment on that.
Well, what we need to keep in mind, sir, I have argued throughout my tenure here, if you can make it as easy as possible for the American people to comply with their tax obligations, they will do so. As you pointed out with the Earned Income Tax Credit, the instructions are almost 30, if not more, pages. And for most people, whether they're college educated or not, trying to understand the tax code is one of the most difficult challenges that they face. When you have a system that allows for electronic filing, as I indicated both in my written and oral statement, that assists taxpayers in complying with the code. And when you have instances, as was pointed out both by Ms. Olson as well as myself, where they are not answering the telephones, where they're closing taxpayer assistance centers and the like, it makes it more difficult for people who either don't have the resources or the ability, meaning a lot of senior citizens, to go to an H&R Block or what have you. So the point being is we need to ensure that the IRS, again, applies the limited resources that they have to providing assistance to taxpayers, and secondly, that they're getting accurate information. As you may recall, we've done examinations in the past which showed at some points almost half of the questions that taxpayers posed to the IRS by way of the telephone call the 800 number, as well as then the most available taxpayer assistance centers were inaccurate. They were wrong. And then when you have tax preparers in the private sector who either intentionally or unintentionally, again, provide incorrect information, the American people overall are harmed because of the reduction in the resources, or revenue rather, that is collected. So the bottom line is we need to make sure that the IRS is able to bring on competent people, have adequate resources in terms of responding to phone calls, but that people can get answers accurately by way of using the IRS.gov system. And I'm concerned about all of those areas, sir. The first, for us, whenever, and it's very rare now because I don't travel, but when I used to speak to tax preparers, I would implore them. They are the front guard for all of this. So if someone is seeking a credit for which they're not entitled, these men and women are the ones who, if they are honorable people, should tell that taxpayer, we cannot and we will not fill that form out for you. And I'm very concerned that that is not happening to the extent that it should.
The automated collection system is a centralized call site, and it was originally set up decades ago to be a way, in a sort of a production environment, to be able to reach out to taxpayers with relatively modest debts and come up with ways of collecting it. But over the years, what it's turned into is a way of using automated levies, et cetera, to go out and, instead of making outgoing calls to taxpayers and talking through collection alternatives, using a few letters and levies to get the taxpayer to call us. And so you're already in a confrontational environment when you're in ACS. And our research has shown that actually ACS is not very effective in collecting dollars. The most effective way that we've got is actually refund offsets, where a taxpayer has a refund in a year and we have a debt on the books and we just grab the refund. And then through installment agreements. And our data has shown that even as the resources available to automated collection service have dropped, that revenue collected through collection has remained stable, inflation adjusted. And what we think is the most effective way is if the IRS could get to those cases early when the dollars are low, and then continue to send letters like a credit card does to taxpayers, but also make some outgoing calls to talk the taxpayer through their collection alternatives, get them in an installment agreement, get it to be a debit agreement from their checking account so it's automatic, and then get them, even more importantly, on the road to future compliance. That should be our focus. Go and sin no more. But this is one of those areas where I have not been able to make headway with the IRS to really review this perceived wisdom that ACS is cost-effective. I think it's not cost-effective. It brings in some money, but it causes problems for taxpayers later on, and we're not working the right cases in ACS either. So that's my assessment.
And if I may just add, Congressman, it is so much more inefficient and costly for the IRS to collect money once it's out the door. And they have to do a cost-benefit analysis. And they have elected, for the most part, to, and whether it's right or wrong, since it's going to be more costly for us to collect X amount of money from a taxpayer, let it go.
Right. Mr. Chairman, can I ask one more question? Sure. On one hand, we hear the record numbers of people are signing up through the Affordable Care Act, and that's a good thing. Yet there are still many people in both houses who would like it to disappear, and others would like it to disappear, not off the books as a law, because they can't, but certainly as by defunding it or not funding it properly. So my question to you may sound like the simplest question or a setup question. What could go wrong if we don't fund properly the Affordable Care Act? I mean, it is the law of the land. It's been, commented on by the Supreme Court. It's not going to go away. What do we do if it doesn't get, what happens to it? Do we begin to talk about bad news where people can't sign up or get hurt? What happens? I mean, we talk about it, but people really haven't analyzed what the full effect would be.
Well, I think you're seeing some of what could go wrong by not funding it with a 43% level of service on the phones and a 75% overage correspondence, where correspondence that the IRS gets, they can't get through in their timeframes, and so taxpayers don't get responses. I think, you know, I've thought a lot about the Affordable Care Act and the administration of it in the IRS, and there are some actual positive things from it. This is the one program where we actually get information returns, like Mr. George was talking about, early in the process, and we can use them as we match these returns. And so in some ways, the IRS has been able to use the work that it's done on the Affordable Care Act to create a model for what we should be doing once we get the legislative authority to receive other information returns earlier in the process, and can, as Russell, you know, Mr. George says, prevent dollars from going out the door that shouldn't. And I think the ACA has really helped us, you know, get there. We're doing that with the Affordable Care Act. I think, you know, one thing I've really thought about is that I'm not a healthcare analyst, but I am a practical tax lawyer, and I think that aligning the sign-up period with the actual filing season, if you're really going to run this through the tax code, it makes sense if they're going to get folks are going to get a penalty. They see that impact between now and April 15th, and that might drive their behavior to sign up the next year. And having that sign-up period not aligned with it doesn't make sense from a behavioral perspective. And that's one thing I've thought about.
And I would just add, sir, that one, obviously, this is unprecedented in terms of the history of this country. And from the perspective, as I view it, of the IRS, they have invested a lot of money, a lot of energy into this. And so it would be a waste if, to the IRS if it is repealed.
The other thing that has happened, if I might add this, is that, you know, a lot of IT projects, some small information technology projects that would be good for taxpayers have been put on hold because the IRS has a limited IT staff and they're focusing on the Affordable Care Act and FATCA. And that has had impact to the taxpayers, you know, increased burden on taxpayers or delayed initiatives that would minimize burden on taxpayers in other areas.
Well, I thank you for your testimony, and of course, as the chairman said before, I thank you for being here today and for the work you do, your service.
Thank you. Mr. Graves?
Hey, Mr. Chairman, Mr. George, good to see you again.
Right, sir.
Ms. Olson. A question about, I saw in your testimony about identification fraud and wanted to talk about that just for a little bit. You indicated in your testimony that it's about $5 billion a year estimated that's still out there with identity theft. And just thinking through the process, and I'm trying to learn how this happens, and maybe I could just ask some questions and hopefully you could help us as a committee see through this a little bit. When is the earliest that one can file their taxes in the given year?
It technically varies depending upon when the IRS decides to open. I mean, once, of course, the tax year begins at the beginning of the calendar year. And now we're speaking generally because you have corporations too that have
Just speaking of individuals.
So I believe this year it was the second or third week of January. And although last year it was delayed because of funding issues. But, and again, and this is not public, I mean, it's not private information, but as I indicated, and I believe as Ms. Olson indicated also, people can file before employers or others who are required to report how much money they have, report that information to the IRS, sir.
So that'd be my second question. So an individual could theoretically this year have filed their taxes the second week of January, so we'll just pick a date by the 14th of January. And when are the W-2s due to be submitted by employers to the IRS?
I believe it's March. It's March.
Okay,
So, yes.
So there's a period of time then in which one can file their taxes and then until, or a gap at Delta, until the business owner or the corporation submits their backup data to reconcile that. And so, and this can be done electronically. I assume an individual can file electronically that second week of January. And then what is the quickest they could get a return or refund?
There is a statutory deadline for that.
I think electronically, there have been some refunds going out within 4 days, but generally a week. And if they file in paper, it could take anywhere from 10 to 14 days to even more weeks.
Okay, let's stay with electronic then for
Yeah.
a second. So 4 to 7 days. So
Yeah.
January 14th, one who might have somebody else's identity, which could only include a name and a social security number, if I'm correct, could submit an electronic filing fraudulently and have a return within 7 days without any corresponding information that would reconcile that. And the IRS would
If I could
deposit
just
that money.
insert here, the IRS over the last few years has been working with some of the largest employers and getting voluntarily their records on the W-2s, for example, before they are required to, we would get them from Social Security. And so the IRS has built some databases for use during the filing season that we will run returns through to see whether the information reported on them matches. But it's basically asking people
I'm
a
just trying to get to
favor.
the $5
Yeah.
billion that
Yeah.
still exist out there and why this occurs. So it's electronically, one can file a return. All they need is a couple of pieces of data. They can file a return. The IRS will then, without reconciling it, deposit money into what could be even onto a debit card, if I understand properly, that could have been purchased at a local retail store, convenience store, or even not even had to be purchased. It could have been given to them without any identification required there as well. So sort of creates a system that leads me to ask the question, are IP addresses, can an IP address allow an unlimited amount of returns to be filed through one IP address, or are there any governing measures on that? And is it domestic only, or can it be throughout the world? Can electronic filing occur?
There's no limit that it is received only in the United States. The IRS recently gave people the opportunity to have, multiple accounts receive refunds. And so I just want to make sure we're clear. It's not even just a Social Security number. An individual taxpayer, what's called an I-10, an individual taxpayer identification number, can also be used to receive, to file and to receive a refund.
If I could just add here, your statement is correct. The IRS has got filters that would help it identify questionable things. So looking at things from certain IP addresses, or the volume coming from IP addresses, or the volume of requests to deposit refunds into one account or on one debit card or things like that. So over time, we have built filters to identify questionable returns. The problem is, no matter how smart the IRS gets, others are out there moving one step ahead of us. And so you're always sort of trackling behind, and that's one way you get to that large, fraud number.
Right. A couple more, if I could. One more. This just has a few questions in my mind about it. So you mentioned not overseas, though. Mr. George, you said, okay, so a filing can occur.
Yes.
Outside of our
Yes.
country. Okay, and through an IP address, and it can happen in multiple filings can occur from one IP address, unless captured by this filter. And you say with certainty, though, IP addresses or multiple filings through one IP address is monitored and filtered.
Well, I can't discuss the filters, but that is something
thought you
that
just did. I'm
anybody
sorry.
would raise questions about. But I will note, preparers legitimately have an IP address that they would be preparing multiple returns through. So
Preparers who put their name on
On the
form,
return,
right?
right.
I'm speaking of those who do
right,
not.
that would
So-
not. That's
right,
correct, and
so
that
I'd
would
like to
raise
clarify that.
eyebrows.
And then might I ask then, do you know how many filings do occur during this period where there's that delta in which one can file a return and which the corresponding data that would reconcile that is filed as well. Is there a number that might correspond there?
I'm going to give you a chance.
Well, I think there are two peaks in our filing season, and so one would be just right out the gate for like the first 2 or 3 weeks, and that's in your delta period, right? From the start of the filing season to about 3 weeks into it, people rush to get their refunds. And then the second peak is at the very end when everybody's like, okay, now I owe money and I've got to meet this deadline. So your problem is in the delta. And if I could just make one point here, one thing that I've recommended in the past, and it's difficult, is not only moving up the dates for us getting that 1099 and W-2 information, but some countries around the world and some states actually don't pay out refunds until after the end of the filing season. So they have file your returns from this date to this date, and then there's a pause for like a month and a half while the tax agency is able to sort through all this stuff so they can see, oh, we've got 2 returns coming in from this Social Security number, or 2 people are claiming the same child as a dependent. And you have that period to sort out before you're paying any refunds. And then they start paying refunds after a certain date. That's really changing the culture in our country, but it is one way that other countries have been able to combat fraud, to have that pause.
And if I just may say, I find it appalling, Congressman, when the message from the IRS is file early so that the criminals can't take advantage of you. It's extremely troubling. And it may be common sense, and again, with resource limitations and what have you, but I am actually very shocked and disappointed by that message.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, might I note for the committee that this $5 billion in identity theft that the General has pointed out is nearly half of the entire IRS budget for 1 year.
Yeah, it's quite a, and General George, I can remember that when that question was asked, how do we prevent this fraud, and the answer was file early. We got to do better than that. Mr. Amade.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And thank you both for the briefing. Ms. Olson, I'm trying to get a sense for, I hear the part about budget cuts and resource allocation. I'm trying to get a sense. The IRS has been cut 17%. Can you give me a feel for what your operation's been cut? Has it become 17, more or less?
My operation this year, you all were very kind to my operation and sustained us and actually gave us a little bit more. And I can only think that the thinking was that since we are the safety valve for the IRS, that when the IRS isn't meeting taxpayer needs, there are more taxpayers with significant hardship, and that means they come to us. And in fact, our cases have increased by 6% so far this year over the year before. We're seeing that.
And then can you give me a profile of the folks that kind of hit in the middle of the driveway that you help? And let me tell you why I'm asking the question, because I know there's statistics out there that the top 10% of the population pays X amount of the tax, but it's a large amount. So I would assume in any organization, when you are, as you should be, pursuing collections, that you go to where those collections are the most in need of pursuit. So I'm assuming that the Warren Buffetts and the Bill Gates of the world aren't calling you up saying, hey, what do I do on my schedule, blah, blah. It's most of those folks who probably fall into however it breaks down. Can you give me an idea of who it is, the demographic, or where on that rainbow those folks fall that you're serving?
Yeah, it's really interesting. We definitely get, lower middle income working families and then small businesses coming in. Now, there's always some large business that can't get an issue resolved. It's usually an account issue that can't get resolved because they're talking to a different person each time they call, and they end up. But the bulk of our cases, 90% of our cases are middle income, low income, working folks, and small businesses who are having problems with the IRS. And those problems can range from collection problems to earned income tax credit problems to other audit problems, accounts problems, and certainly identity theft has been, for the last 3 or 4 years, the largest portion of our case receipts each year, going anywhere from 20% to 27% of our case receipts in any given year. That's thousands and thousands of identity theft cases.
So you're serving, and these, if these aren't your words, don't adopt them, but you're serving predominantly people who represent generally what portion of income to the IRS?
We've actually never really done an
Percentage-wise.
income thing, but I would say, middle to low income. And again, small business, so very small business, sole proprietors.
Okay. Would it be possible if you had some time to?
Yes, absolutely. We could pull a sample of our population and look at their most recent returns.
Okay.
I'd be glad to give that to you.
Thank you. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Yoder.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Inspector George, welcome to the committee. Ms. Olson, thank you for being here today. I note in your testimony, Ms. Olson, your comments regarding the culture at the IRS, and I think it is a concern that has grown from a concern to an outrage amongst Americans in the country, and the lack of trust between citizens and their government, and a lot of it stems from the abuse of that trust by the IRS. And I note certainly the ongoing abusive practices related to, or at least the hopefully not ongoing abusive practices related to targets and auditing and harassing of Americans based upon their free speech rights and their engagement in standing up for their beliefs, that they might be targeted by the taxing entity in the United States. I note that in recent years, there have been reports of the IRS reading the private emails of Americans without a warrant in violation of their Fourth Amendment rights. And the IRS's response or their position was Americans do not have an expectation of privacy in their email accounts. Americans do, and they disagree. I note the presence of Congressman Roscom, who's been very outspoken on this issue, that in recent weeks there have been much light shed on the fact that the IRS has been seizing the assets of Americans without due process, without any crime required, without any allegations, without any representation. This is more than a culture. This is an agency that has destroyed the trust between it and the American people. It believes it's above the law. It believes it can ignore the constitutional rights of Americans. And it is just a wonder every day to pick up the newspaper and read about what constitutional rights are being violated by the IRS, whether it's the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment. And it is beyond a culture. It is a broken agency. And maybe it's time to consider wholesale change. Maybe it's time to consider the fair tax. Maybe it's time to consider something completely different, because what's happening at the IRS is not working, and Americans are outraged. And so I look towards the Inspector General and Ms. Olson for your ideas, but I know that there has been many throughout history who have noted that the power to tax is the power to destroy. And that's what's happening in this country today. And Americans are outraged, and I want to know what the Inspector General, Ms. Olson, what you think should be done, and how we correct these abuses of the Americans' freedom and constitutional rights.
Go ahead, please.
All right. Well, I think there's a lot in your statement. I too share the concerns about the civil asset forfeiture, and I think some of the oversight that this Congress is doing on that and looking at the due process protections that may need to be added to that process are very important. I think that in terms of the culture, I make a distinction. I think in each of the instances that you've raised, it's a very small portion of the 90,000 IRS employees who are involved in that. And I think there we really need to look at those actions and see what more we need to be done. I will also note that the IRS adopted, after I'd recommended it for years in June, a Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And one of those rights is the right to privacy, the right to confidentiality, the right to a fair and just tax system. And, Mr. Roscom and this House voted it passed it last summer, and I believe there'll be some action this year. And I've recommended that you actually codify that and hold the commissioner accountable for making sure that those rights are worked and honored in every aspect of tax administration. And frankly, only then will you get back the trust of the American taxpayer.
And I would simply add, sir, I think you were quoting Lord Acton about the power to tax being the power to destroy. There's no question at all that resonates with people. Although I should preface my statement by saying, since President Reagan's administration, sir, the Secretary of the Treasury has issued a directive to discuss tax policy for the Department of the Treasury. It is given sole authority to the Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy. So I need to adhere to that. So, but the bottom line is, it has to be fair. People have to know that they're being treated respectfully. And I will note this, because, again, I was a staffer on Capitol Hill when the IRS Restructuring and Reform Act was passed, which created TIGTA. And I don't know whether, and Ms. Olson's office. So it seems that periodically the IRS experiences this period where things are amiss. And I'm not sure, sir, whether you were here or not, but I earlier, again, gave a lot of credit to the current commissioner, who is an extraordinarily experienced executive and who is taking these matters quite seriously, and I think will hopefully have a positive impact on the workings of the IRS.
Well, I appreciate your response. There's a lot of work to do here, and I think beyond just a Bill of Rights, I think there need to be wholesale changes of how we operate the IRS and maybe looking at complete reform, things like the fair tax. I do want to ask one other question, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for a little more time here to just ask about the earned income tax credit. It now ranges in fraud or misapplied payments in the amount of $16 to $19 billion. It's 24 to 29% of the entire program. And I think about some of the priorities I have in Congress, helping educate young children through Head Start. We spend $9 billion on that. NIH funding, we spend $31 billion on that. The ability to invest in things that matter to this country by those lost dollars and the impact it has on young children or cancer research, I think is heartbreaking. And it also speaks to the inability of the IRS to solve this problem, because it goes on year after year. We've been working on trying to get to the heart of what causes this, and we see that there's a rise in the misapplied payments and the fraud from folks who file on their own, don't file through a preparer, and there are different standards that are applied in those cases. And so I guess my question would be, do you believe that tax filers make, when online self-filing, that those certifications are best designed to prevent fraud and prevent improper payments? Do you have any further suggestions for eliminating improper payments across the board? And what are the consequences for knowingly filing an EITC certification via a paid preparer? Are they the same as falsifying online self-preparation?
Again, sir, I don't recall whether you were here. The instructions for filing the earned income tax credit are extraordinarily complicated. And so obviously if somebody wants to commit we have a voluntary compliance system. So if someone wants to cheat on their taxes, unless you require third-party reporting on everything that anyone earns, people will be able to do so. The key, of course, would be for the IRS to make examples of people who are caught having cheated on any aspect of their tax return. That obviously practically cannot work because of the millions of people involved and the billions of dollars involved. I will say this. For over 20 years, the earned income tax credit has been one of the most abused credits of in the tax system. And while some progress was made at one point, not enough has been done. And the commissioner knows this, Congress knows this. So again, unless you're going to start arresting people and prosecuting and parading them in front of cameras, I really don't have a definitive answer for you.
Could I make a comment about that? I think that there are multiple sources of error and fraud in the earned income tax credit. And I entered tax practice when the earned income tax credit was enacted, so I sort of feel like we're good buddies from 1975 on. I do think, I've wondered about that decline in prepared returns, and I think really there are preparers involved. They're just no longer signing them. And that might go to an IP address thing. Can you find out whether you're getting a number of these returns from one address or going into one bank account? But preparer regulation is, for this unenrolled population, is going to be huge. Because if you can deal with, and a preparer strategy, if you can deal with one preparer who's doing bad returns, you're not just going one taxpayer by one taxpayer, you're getting the whole batch of those returns. The other thing is we've made legislative recommendations for changing the statute itself that might help minimize some of the opportunity for fraud. And the third thing that I would say, we have done research that shows that the IRS is actually not auditing the right issue. When they're doing their audits of EITC, they're not auditing the issue that actually our own IRS's own research has shown has the most dollars associated with it. So they're sort of going after the lowest hanging and easiest fruit rather than the area where you might be able to move the dial on improper payments. And those are just three things that I would comment on.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And also remind the members that the commissioner will be coming before the subcommittee, and a lot of those questions can be directed to him. I think for those that missed the opening statement, I think Ms. Olson and Inspector George really brought out some of the things that they're working on in ways to improve, and that's kind of their job, and we appreciate that very much. Let's go to Ms. Herrera-Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I apologize for, it's constituent visit time on top of hearing time. So it's multiple places at once. But, so I apologize. I have a couple of questions, and I find this horribly fascinating. It's terrifying to me that this is what we're having to deal with and work through. I mean, each one of the issues raised is a giant tragedy of a play unto itself. So I thank you both for the work that you're doing. Mr. George, you estimate that in the 2013 season, as much as $2.3 billion were erroneously given to corporations in carry-forward credits. However, the IRS doesn't plan, as best I can tell, to follow your recommendations to address it. We've talked a little bit about that. And then you went on to say that the IRS is dedicating significant resources toward addressing what it believes is the most significant risk to compliance, the use of flow-through entities such as partnerships. Flow-through entities, as corporations, from my experience, in my region, in my district, are the small family-owned businesses. In fact, I got to tour one this last week. And obviously, some of the biggest users of carry-forward credits are giant corporations, publicly traded, correct? Do you have any idea why the IRS is ignoring that $2.3 billion? I mean, as we were talking about NIH funding and cancer funding and all these other things, it's hard to understand their priorities here.
And please, I hate to punt here, but that is a policy question, Congresswoman, and I'm going to have to defer on that one.
Okay. Well, we look forward to the commissioner joining us. Let me switch to, I actually have a couple more questions for you, if that's okay. Your testimony highlights several of the shocking behaviors. We've been talking about it all morning. Most notably to me is that the IRS is rehiring those that it fired, those specific employees who were, I feel like, acting as predators. They're supposed to be protecting and at the very least adhering to the law, but in many cases were selling folks out. Help us understand the IRS's response to this and possibly how we could, I mean, we've brought this committee's brought this up to the commissioner in years past. How do we make a dent here?
Again, Congressman, before you arrived, I pointed out the fact that the commissioner, John Koskinen, and I speak, if not every day, every other day. And while I don't want to steal his thunder on this very issue. He called me Monday and issued to me a statement about the fact that they saw the report, and while initially his staff pushed back, it's part of, again, what occurred under the Restructuring and Reform Act of 1998, which issued a listing of things that if IRS employees did or violated, they were subject to everything from just, admonition to removal. And so to make a long story short, they are going to change their policies as it relates to that. And I think at his appearance before this committee, he'll make a formal statement as to what those changes are. Obviously, it was repellent that they would allow people who were accused of engaging in the behavior that we identified were able to be rehired. A lot of these people were seasonal people. As you may know, during the filing season, the IRS hires tens of thousands of people to help process tax returns. And the bulk of the people that we identified in that report were in that pool. And now, in all candor, he has to make some choices, because if he can't hire 30,000 people, they can't process tax returns unless everyone files electronically. And then there are some instances. I mean, you're innocent until proven guilty. If you're accused of a tax violation, you have the right to appeal it, and some people win their appeals. So you have to be fair to people, and yet at the same time, it's just the appearance.
Well, and I think that's it. When we were talking about credibility here, the IRS has to be above reproach. It's not, there are so many reasons. And so I think if it takes more time and effort to make sure they get it right, it's worth it.
I agree.
Okay, thank you. Yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize one of the new members of the subcommittee, Mr. Ridgel, who's from Virginia.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I'm delighted to be here. And like some of the other members, my preference would have been, of course, to have been here from the very beginning, but the schedule just didn't permit that. So if what I ask, if there is a bit of redundancy here, I apologize in advance for it, but this is an important topic, and I thank you both for being here and for your service. I do. I was raised by a NASA engineer, and so this idea of how we view the federal employee, to me, is very important. I see as fellow Americans trying to do the right thing. Now, that said, we're in a tough spot here with the IRS on multiple levels, and I'd like to draw your attention, Inspector George, to just the first contact that a taxpayer can have with the IRS, and a hardworking American trying to get it right, trying to pay his or her taxes, trying to get guidance on this. And you know where I'm going with this. The trends are just not good in terms of response time. We're heading in the wrong direction, and it's a serious thing. You get to where you're on hold for 30 minutes. This is very discouraging, and it does breed a lack of confidence, if not contempt, for the agency. So if you would, in a concise way as you can, try to explain, to help me to understand why that's the case, and we'll see where we go on the follow-up question.
It's resources, sir.
Okay, I thought so. Let me ask you this. This is something that I think is really important here. And I don't go to work every day at the IRS, clearly, but it seems like there's this consistent pattern of it's always more money. Now, if you could provide some objective metric, some table that shows, cost per call, the number of applications or tax returns that have been filed on the ratio of the number of IRS employees, for example, you could show some linkage here. I'd be more open to the argument, but what has to happen, certainly in the private sector, and I think it must happen in the public sector, is this belief that productivity and increased customer service are not mutually exclusive. And if the leaders themselves don't believe that, then there's no way the organization's going to move in that direction. So if you would, please, address that whole mindset that it's not always more resources. Help me to understand your view on that.
Sir, and I beg the chairman's because he has heard me, I think, recite the following that
Okay.
that you haven't.
And
But
thank you for your patience in saying it to me.
well, but
All right.
this is so important. It's called third-party reporting, sir. There is a high correlation between tax compliance and third-party information reporting and withholding. The IRS itself estimates individuals whose wages are subject to self-reporting, or withholding rather, so reporting by a third party, report 99% of their wages. So if a business or, anyone else reports to the IRS,
Right.
we pay, Russell George, $100, you'll get 100% from me, but 99% from most people.
There you go. For the record. Okay.
Now, self-employed individuals who operate non-farm businesses are estimated to report only 68% of their income for tax purposes. So again, these are people who are not given, that information is not given to the IRS by, at all. So they're estimated to report only a little more than 2/3. But here's the most, I think, shocking figure. Self-employed individuals who operate businesses on a cash basis are estimated to report only 19%.
The numbers don't surprise me, and let me pivot back, though, for a moment, because I know you're trying to answer my question, but I think we passed each other on this, because what I was seeking clarification on is the culture, the ethos, the mindset of the senior leadership within the IRS that productivity and increased customer service to the taxpayer are not mutually exclusive. That is, that with the same number of staff or the same amount of resources, that if we maybe have a different workflow, we leverage technology, that we can have both. Increased productivity, we can reduce the amount of time it takes to answer a call, which is now about less than half are being, to where the taxpayer is actually speaking to the representative, and then they're on hold waiting for that for about 30 minutes. So I don't think you answered that part. And I don't see that my clock is winding down, so I'm not exactly sure how the time works here in the committee yet, but the chairman will remind me.
Well, you're almost out of time.
I imagine.
May I attempt to
Please,
answer that?
that's really, to me,
Yeah.
we're in an area, in a time of increasing austerity, principally because of healthcare costs, and that's just a whole nother subject. But we're going to have compression on the rest of the budget into perpetuity because of mandatory spending, defense, transportation, education, and on agencies like the IRS. So this mindset of getting more and having higher productivity has got to be part of how we think.
I think that I know that the IRS leadership is actively working on a concept of operations for the years to come that will incorporate online taxpayer accounts so that taxpayers can see what's going on. They can communicate with the IRS electronically. They can send documents to the IRS, trying to drive some of the traffic on the phones over to in the electronic environment. And I think that will then allow the resources on the phones to be able to address the issues that people really need to talk to somebody about.
Ms.
The
Ms.
problem,
Olson,
yes, I'm
just
sorry.
out of respect for the chairman, I think he's about to hit the button, but I just wanted to tell you, I thank you both. But my parting thought is that this idea of increasing productivity and simultaneously increasing response rates, if the leaders themselves don't believe it, it'll never happen. And so I just want to be sure that that message is dispersed to the extent that it can be. I thank the chairman and yield back.
Thank you. Yeah, we've taken a little liberty with the clock today, and I think everybody's had a chance to ask as many questions as they might want. I know Mr. Serrano has another question.
Right, let me first turn to our new colleague, that what the chairman is doing is he had an eraser. He was just erasing things he had written on the wall there, and Crenshaw was here, that kind of thing. on a lighter level, I just read where Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao are going to make close to $250 million. I think the IRS is going to have with that and pay-per-view with HBO and Showtime. I think there'll be a little income coming in to the nation's treasury. I wish I knew what percentages they pay for that kind of money, you know, and does Manny have to pay in the Philippines, and do we have an arrangement with that? But I'll ask the commissioner that. Let me just talk to you about the EO unit and follow up some of the questions that were asked before. That was an area, believe it or not, where we saw bipartisan outrage. And there was a discussion about whether one side was targeted, another side was targeted. It didn't matter. We thought both sides were targeted. On this side, we thought both sides were targeted, and we didn't like it. And now your testimony says that changes have taken place at that unit. Then we hear that they're rehiring some people that might have been part of the problem. So my question to both of you is, what changes have taken place? Should the American people and the Congress feel more confident that this will not happen again, or certainly, you know, can be prevented in the future, because it was embarrassing to everyone? And like I said, it was a bipartisan outrage. It wasn't, you know, us against them or them against us. And secondly, budget cuts. Are there now enough people at that unit to be able to take care of the changes that need to be made?
As to the second question, sir, I'll have to defer rather to the commissioner. He needs to, I don't know the answer to that question. As to your first question, the IRS has agreed to every one of the recommendations that we issued in that report, which preceded his arrival, out of fairness to him. We are in the process now of validating whether or not that is actually the case. We also made a commitment to the Mr. Cummings and informed then Chairman Issa of the fact that we were going to, and we are in the process of looking at how the IRS treated groups that were not related to Tea Party, Patriot, and the other groups that was identified initially by the IRS as being part of the groups they had, you know, I'm going to use the word targeted now just as because you used it, but that's not the word we used. I cannot, we're human beings, sir. And so you can have every rule in the world, and if someone wants to disregard the rule, they can. And again, with the IRS ranging from 80+ thousand to, at its height, 100+ thousand, I mean, there are bad apples everywhere. So I cannot sit here and, you know, before Congress say that nothing could ever reoccur.
Right.
But, you know, I think in this environment, you know, you're dealing with some smart people now at the head of that organization, and I'm optimistic that they will avoid a repeat of this type of behavior.
Well, I think that statement is a good one. I mean, I don't expect you to, of course, say, you know, what human nature will be like or human behavior will be like, but if you, in your position, feel that it's tightened up, that there are people trying to make sure it doesn't happen again, that's certainly satisfactory to me. I don't know if it is to other members of the committee. Like you said, you can't judge what people will do, but you can certainly put in place rules that make it harder for them to practice it or to do it. Ms. Olson?
Well, I view what had happened, and I say this not trying to minimize it, as really managerial malpractice, that there was a lack of serious attention and assistance being given to the frontline employees who were trying to get answers. And that's why entities that were selected and targeted did not get action on them. And those kinds of managerial failures have been corrected. There are processes in place for review and getting answers and information that didn't exist when all of that was going on. I would say that right now, what's happening with the returns is that the IRS has changed the rules, saying all you have to do is attest that a certain percentage of your activity will not be put to political activity, electioneering, and you're fine. And then they're going to rely on audits on the back end to see if they've got any abuses there. And so we're not really out of the woods here yet because we don't know how they're going to be auditing these entities, what they're going to think is an abuse later on. And that brings back to, I really do believe that Congress needs to act to give a little bit better definition and guidance to the IRS about what constitutes political activity and what is the incorrect or the untolerated level of political activity. I've made a legislative recommendation in my report to Congress this year about that, and I think that will help enormously. But I do think we'll have to see how the IRS selects entities for audit before we can say, where we are on this.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Serrano, and thank everyone. I've got some more questions, but I'll submit them to the record, and I know others as well. But let me again thank you all for being here, because I know you've got a tough job. You as you started your testimony, the things that you're doing to try to help us, we're all trying to help the IRS, and everybody knows the IRS has never been one of the most endearing agencies to most people in America. And it seems like when we started all this, when Commissioner Werfel was the new guy, and I asked him, I said, do you think the IRS has betrayed the trust of the American people? And he said, yes. And I think there's a lot that goes into restoring that trust. And quite frankly, I don't think complaining about the lack of money or not answering the telephone or things like that, I don't think that's the best way to restore trust. But I do think the things that you all have come up with, the recommendations that you see every day, if we were to implement those, and I think that's up to the commissioner, and he's going to come before us, and we'll have a lot of questions for him. But you've done a great job, a great service, I think, in the work that you do to let us know your view of the world as it relates to the IRS. We want to do a better job, and ultimately we want the IRS to do a better job. So again, thank you for being here today. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, sir.